The massive steel deck of the USS Hornet pitched violently in the Pacific swells as Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stared at the 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers secured to the carrier's flight deck. It was April 18, 1942, and America desperately needed a victory. Just 4 months after Pearl Harbor had devastated the Pacific Fleet, the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable, rolling across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide of conquest. Doolittle's weathered hands gripped the ship's railing as spray from a particularly large wave soaked his leather flight jacket. At 45, he was older than most of his crews, but his reputation as one of America's finest aviators preceded him. The mission they were about to attempt had never been tried before, launching fully loaded Army Air Force bombers from an aircraft carrier deck to strike the Japanese homeland itself. The idea had seemed impossible when it was first proposed. Army bombers were never designed to take off from the abbreviated runway of a carrier deck, and the B-25 Mitchell, while nimble for its size, required significantly more space than Navy dive bombers. Yet here they were, 600 miles from the Japanese coast, preparing to do exactly that. The 80 volunteer crewmen had trained intensively at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs until they could get their heavily loaded bombers airborne. In less than 500 feet, they had studied photographs of Japanese cities until they could navigate Tokyo's streets from memory. Most importantly, they had accepted that this was likely a one-way mission. The chances of all 16 crews surviving were slim at best. As dawn broke over the great Pacific waters, Doolittle gathered his men for final instructions. Their faces were a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. They knew they were about to make history, but they also knew that Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns would be waiting for them over Tokyo Bay. According to contemporary Navy records from the National Archives, the Hornet Task Force had maintained strict radio silence for the past week, approaching Japanese waters undetected. Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr.'s carriers had successfully evaded Japanese patrol boats, but their luck wouldn't hold much longer. The 16 bombers carried a total of 64 500-pound bombs, a modest payload by later war standards, but symbolically enormous. These would be the first American bombs to fall on the Japanese mainland since the war began. The psychological impact would far exceed the physical damage. Doolittle climbed into his B-25, nicknamed Doolittle's Raider, and began his pre-flight checklist. His crew, pilot Richard Eugene Cole, navigator Henry Amon Potter, bombardier Fred Anthony Brammer, and gunner Paul John Leonard, had become like brothers during their intensive training. They represented the cream of American aviation, volunteers who had stepped forward when their country needed heroes. The mission that would become known as the Doolittle Raid was about to begin, and with it, America would deliver its first blow directly to the heart of the Japanese Empire. The klaxon's urgent wail pierced the morning air as the USS Hornet turned into the wind, her massive engines driving the 33,000-ton carrier to maximum speed. At 0800 hours on April 18, 1942, the moment of truth had arrived. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle's gloved hand rested on the throttle of his B-25 Mitchell as deck crews made final preparations for the most audacious bombing mission in military history. The Hornet's flight deck stretched before them, what it seemed impossibly short for aircraft designed to operate from mile-long runways. Each bomber had been positioned with its nose wheel just inches from the tail of the aircraft ahead, maximizing every precious foot of deck space. The wind whipped across the carrier at 30 knots, adding crucial lift to help get the heavy bombers airborne. Naval Aviator Lieutenant Henry Leonard Miller stood at the bow of the ship, checkered flag in hand, ready to guide each bomber's takeoff. His job was critical. Releasing the pilots too early would send them plunging into the Pacific waves, while waiting too long might cause them to run out of deck space. The margin for error was non-existent. Doolittle's engines roared to life first, the twin Wright R2600 Cyclone radials developing full power. Black smoke streamed from the exhaust stacks as he held the brakes, building maximum RPM. Through his cockpit window, he could see the ocean rushing past the carrier's edge, a sobering reminder of what awaited any pilot who miscalculated. Miller raised his flag, held it steady as the Hornet's bow rose on a swell, then snapped it down. Doolittle released his brakes and the heavily loaded bomber lurched forward, gathering speed with agonizing slowness. The deck rushed beneath his landing gear as the end of the flight deck approached with terrifying speed. At the very last moment, the B-25 lifted off, clearing the carrier's bow with mere feet to spare. One by one, The remaining 15 bombers followed. Lieutenant Travis Hoover in Ruptured Duck was second off the deck, followed by Lieutenant Robert Meter Gray in Whiskey Pete. Each takeoff was a heart-stopping gamble against physics and fate. The crews, who weren't flying yet, stood watching from the island's superstructure, their faces tense with concentration as they witnessed their comrades either succeed or fail in real time. The 8th bomber, piloted by Captain Edward Joseph York, experienced engine problems immediately after takeoff. Rather than risk a water landing, York made the difficult decision to divert to the Soviet Union, knowing his crew would face internment but likely survive. His sacrifice allowed the mission to continue without alerting Japanese forces to the approaching raid. As reported in declassified War Department documents, the launch sequence took exactly 59 minutes to complete by 0920 hours. All 16 bombers were airborne and forming up in loose formation, flying west toward Japan at low altitude to avoid radar detection. The Hornet Task Force immediately turned east and began a high-speed retreat toward Pearl Harbor. Flying just 50 feet above the wave tops, the raiders crossed 600 miles of empty Pacific Ocean. Their fuel gauges showed consumption rates higher than calculated. The long takeoff runs and formation flying had burned precious gasoline that would be needed for the return flight to China. Several pilots began to realize they might not have enough fuel to reach the designated Chinese airfields. Radio operator Corporal Jacob Ironman monitored Japanese frequencies as they approached the coast, noting increasing chatter that suggested enemy radar operators were tracking unidentified aircraft approaching the mainland. The element of surprise, crucial to their survival, was beginning to evaporate. At 12:15 hours, the Japanese coastline appeared through the haze ahead. Doolittle's raiders had achieved the impossible. They had successfully launched Army bombers from a Navy carrier, had flown them across the Pacific to strike at the very heart of the Japanese Empire. Now came the most dangerous part of their mission, the bombing run over Tokyo itself. At exactly 12:30 hours on April 18, 1942, air raid sirens began wailing across Tokyo for the first time since the war began. Japanese civilians, who had been told their sacred homeland was invulnerable to attack, looked up in disbelief as 16 twin-engine bombers roared overhead at rooftop level. The unthinkable was happening. American aircraft were over the Emperor's capital. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle's B-25 Doolittle's Raider was the first to reach the city, streaking across Tokyo Bay at 200 miles per hour and barely 100 feet altitude. From his pilot's seat, Doolittle could see Japanese civilians running for cover in the streets below, their white faces turned upward in shock and terror. Anti-aircraft batteries that had never fired a shot in anger scrambled to engage targets, moving to fast and to low for effective response. Bombardier Fred Anthony Brammer hunched over his Norden bomb sight. As they approached their primary target, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the massive industrial complex sprawled along the waterfront, its dry docks and weapons factories clearly visible through the bomb sight's crosshairs. "Bombay." Doors open, Brammer called over the intercom, his voice steady despite the flak bursts beginning to pepper the sky around them. The first American bombs to fall on Japanese soil in World War II tumbled from Doolittle's bomber. At 12:36 hours, striking the naval arsenal with devastating precision. Explosions boomed across the facility as 500-pound demolition bombs tore through machine shops, administrative buildings, and fuel storage tanks. Secondary explosions indicated that significant damage was being inflicted on Japan's war production capability. Behind Doolittle, the remaining 15 bombers spread across Tokyo and surrounding cities in a coordinated attack that had been planned down to the minute. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's Ruptured Duck targeted the Ogura oil refinery, while Lieutenant Robert Meter Gray's Whiskey Pete aimed for the Tokyo Gas and Electric Engineering Company. Each crew had specific industrial and military targets chosen for maximum strategic impact. The Japanese response was chaotic and ineffective. Fighter pilots at nearby airfields scrambled to intercept the raiders, but by the time Nakajima Key for 3 Oscar fighters reached combat altitude, the American bombers had already completed their bomb runs and were racing toward the Chinese coast at wave top level. The few interceptors that managed to engage found themselves outmaneuvered by pilots who had trained extensively for low-level escape tactics. Major John Hilger's bomber targeted the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant in Nagoya, Japan's second-largest city. As reported in post-war Japanese government assessments, compiled by General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence staff, the raid caused significant damage to aircraft engine production facilities. that wouldn't be fully repaired for months. The psychological impact was even greater. Japanese citizens began to realize that their government's promises of absolute protection were hollow. Captain David Mobley Jones's hurricarrier struck targets in Kobe, while Lieutenant William Gardner Farrow's bomber hit installations in Nagoya. Each successful bomb run sent shockwaves through Japanese military leadership, who had assured Emperor Hirohito that such attacks were impossible. The myth of Japanese invulnerability was crumbling with each explosion. Radio intercepts revealed the panic spreading through Japanese command structures. Fighter squadrons were being scrambled from airfields across Honshu, but the raiders were already beyond interception range. Flying southeast toward China, across the East China Sea, the attack had lasted less than 30 minutes, but its effects would reverberate for years. As the last bomber disappeared over the horizon, Tokyo's fire brigades fought blazes at dozens of locations across the city. Industrial facilities smoldered, oil storage tanks burned, and government buildings showed the scars of American bombs. More importantly, Japanese morale had suffered its first serious blow since Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle raiders had accomplished their primary objective, proving that Japan itself was vulnerable to American air power. The physical damage, while significant, paled in comparison to the strategic and psychological victory they had achieved. America had struck back at the heart of the Japanese Empire, and the war in the Pacific would never be the same. The 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers streaked across the East China Sea at maximum speed, their crews desperately calculating fuel consumption as they raced toward Chinese airfields. It was 13:30 hours on April 18, 1942, and Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle knew their successful bombing of Japan meant nothing if they couldn't reach friendly territory alive. Behind them, the Japanese mainland was in chaos. Radio intercepts revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had ordered every available fighter aircraft to pursue and destroy the American raiders. Kawanishi H-6A Mavis flying boats were being launched from seaplane bases across the Japanese archipelago, while land-based fighters from a dozen airfields joined the massive hunt for the bombers that had dared to strike the secret homeland. Fuel gauges throughout the raider formation showed consumption rates far higher than mission planners had calculated. The lengthy takeoff runs from the USS Hornet's deck, combined with the formation flying in full throttle escape from Japanese airspace, had burned precious gasoline that would be needed for the 600-mile flight to Chinese airfields. Several pilots began making grim calculations about their chances of reaching the mainland. Flying Officer Robert Scott Emmons, co-pilot of Captain Edward Joseph York's bomber, watched his fuel gauges with growing alarm as they approached the China coast. Their aircraft had developed engine problems during takeoff from the Hornet, forcing them to burn fuel at an unsustainable rate. York made the difficult decision to divert to the Soviet Union, knowing his crew would face internment but might survive the war. The weather was deteriorating rapidly as the remaining 15 bombers approached the Chinese coast. Heavy overcast and rain squalls reduced visibility to less than a mile, making navigation by visual landmarks nearly impossible. The planned landing fields at Chucho and Yesha were completely obscured by clouds, forcing the crews to rely on dead reckoning and hope. Lieutenant Dean Everett Hallmark's bomber was the first to run critically low on fuel. Flying at maximum range cruise settings, his twin right radials began to sputter as the tanks ran dry just 50 miles from the Chinese coast. Hallmark ordered his crew to prepare for a water landing in the rough seas below, but Staff Sergeant Donald Eldred Fitzmaurice spotted a small island through the murk. As documented in post-war interrogation reports from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, several raiders were forced to crash land or bail out over Japanese-occupied territory. The crews faced an impossible choice: attempt water landings in the storm-tossed sea or risk capture by Japanese forces who had already demonstrated their brutality toward American prisoners. Doolittle's own bomber ran out of fuel in 1915 hours, forcing him and his crew to bail out over mountainous terrain in free China. The aging lieutenant colonel, who had never made a parachute jump in combat, found himself dangling from silk shrouds in complete darkness as rain lashed the mountainside below. His bomber crashed in flames on a hillside, leaving the crew stranded in hostile territory with only basic survival equipment. Technical Sergeant David John Thatcher, flight engineer aboard Lieutenant Ted Lawson's ruptured duck, helped his injured crewmates after their bomber crash-landed on a Chinese beach. Lawson had suffered severe leg injuries that would later require amputation, while Bombardier Robert Smith Clever had sustained a head wound that left him semi-conscious. Chinese guerrilla fighters found them the next morning and began the dangerous process of evacuating them toward free China. The crew of Lieutenant William Gardner Farrow's bomber wasn't as fortunate. Shot down over Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang, they were captured by enemy forces and faced interrogation, torture, and eventual execution. Their sacrifice exemplified the courage of all the raiders, who had volunteered for a mission knowing the odds of survival were minimal. By dawn on April 19th, the fate of all 16 crews was becoming clear. Most had survived their forced landings, but several were in Japanese hands or stranded behind enemy lines. The successful bombing of Tokyo had come at a terrible price, but the strategic impact was already becoming apparent as Japanese forces began a massive retaliation against Chinese civilians suspected of helping the American airmen. The escape phase of the Doolittle raid was proving as dangerous as the attack itself, with American heroes scattered across thousands of square miles of hostile territory, fighting for their lives in a land torn apart by war. Dawn broke gray and miserable over the mountains of Zhejiang province on April 19, 1942, as Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle struggled through dense undergrowth, with his parachute tangled around his shoulders. The 55-year-old aviator had spent the night huddled under a rocky overhang, listening to the sound of his burning B-25 Mitchell bomber crackling in the valley below. He was alone in Japanese-occupied China with no way to contact friendly forces. The fate of the other 15 crews was becoming clear as the sun climbed higher. Lieutenant Ted William Lawson's ruptured duck had crash-landed on a beach near Shanzhou, leaving the pilot with severe injuries that would eventually cost him his left leg. Bombardier Robert Smith Clever had suffered a serious head wound, while the other crew members were battered but mobile. Chinese fishermen found them at first light and began the dangerous process of hiding them from Japanese patrols. 300 miles to the north, Captain David Mobley Jones and his crew were having better luck. After bailing out over free Chinese territory, they had been found by nationalist guerrilla fighters who recognized them as American airmen. The guerrillas, led by a former Chinese Air Force officer named Captain Tung Sheng Liu, began moving them toward the provisional capital at Chungking through a network of safe houses and mountain trails. According to declassified records from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the Japanese response to the raid was swift and brutal. Lieutenant General Shunro Kuhada, commanding the China Expeditionary Army, ordered massive retaliation against Chinese civilians suspected of helping the American airmen. Entire villages were burned, and an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians would eventually die. In what became known as the Zhejiang Campaign, Doolittle, meanwhile, had made contact with a Chinese woodcutter who led him to a small village where Catholic missionaries provided shelter and medical attention. Father John Birch, an American missionary who would later be killed by communist forces, helped coordinate the evacuation of several raider crews. Through his network of Chinese Christian contacts, the missionaries risked their lives to help the Americans, knowing that capture meant torture and execution. Technical Sergeant David John Thatcher emerged as an unsung hero during the escape phase. Despite having no medical training, he cared for the severely injured crew of Ruptured Duck for weeks. As they were moved through Japanese-occupied territory, his dedication to keeping Lieutenant Lawson alive during the grueling evacuation through mountains and swamps demonstrated the brotherhood that bound the raiders together. The crew of Lieutenant Robert Meter Gray's Whiskey Pete faced their own ordeal. After being captured near Iwan, Bombardier Jacob Eierman, Navigator Charles Joseph Ozick Jr., and Flight Engineer Leland Delroy fought to join their pilot in Japanese custody, where they faced months of imprisonment under conditions that violated every international law. Regarding treatment of prisoners of war, Flight Surgeon Lieutenant Thomas Robert White, who had volunteered as a gunner on Lieutenant Donald Graysmith's bomber, used his medical training to treat injured Chinese civilians. During their escape route, his actions helped cement relationships with local populations who risked everything to help the Americans reach safety. The mutual sacrifice created bonds that would last long after the war ended. By the end of April, the fate of all 80 Doolittle raiders was becoming clear. 69 had survived their crashes and were either safe in free China or making their way toward nationalist lines. 3 had been killed in crashes, and 8 were in Japanese custody facing interrogation, torture, and potential execution. The human cost of America's first strike against Japan was becoming apparent, but so was the unbreakable spirit of the men who had volunteered for the impossible mission. The Doolittle raid's escape phase demonstrated that courage comes in many forms, not just in flying bombers off aircraft carriers, but in enduring suffering, helping wounded comrades and maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The Japanese response to the Doolittle raid was swift, merciless, and far exceeded the physical damage inflicted by the American bombers. Within 48 hours of the attack, Lieutenant General Shunroku Hada's China Expeditionary Army launched Operation Seigo, a massive retaliation campaign that would devastate the Chinese provinces where the raiders had landed. The Imperial Japanese Army was determined to ensure that no Chinese civilian would ever again dare to help American airmen. General Hada's forces, consisting of over 100,000 troops from 5 divisions, swept through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces with orders to destroy any village, town, or city that might have provided assistance to the American crews. The Japanese military employed biological warfare for the first time in the Pacific conflict, dropping plague-infected fleas and cholera-contaminated rice in areas where raiders were suspected to have landed. The resulting epidemics would claim thousands of civilian lives. The 8 captured Doolittle raiders faced a different but equally horrific fate. Lieutenant Robert John Meader, captured after the crash of Whiskey Pete, was subjected to months of interrogation and torture in Bridge House Prison in Shanghai. The Japanese interrogators, led by Colonel Sotojiro Tatsuda of the Kempeitai Military Police, were determined to extract every detail about American aircraft carrier operations and future bombing plans. Meanwhile, the strategic consequences of the raid were reverberating through Japanese military planning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized that the Doolittle raid had exposed a critical weakness in Japan's defenses. American aircraft carriers operating within 600 miles of the Japanese coast posed an existential threat to the homeland that could not be ignored. Emperor Hirohito, whose divine status had been challenged by the appearance of American bombers over his palace, demanded immediate action to prevent future attacks. The Imperial General Headquarters accelerated plans for the Midway operation, hoping to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would eliminate the carrier threat permanently. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic errors of the Pacific War. The Chinese nationalist government under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek faced a terrible dilemma, as Japanese forces systematically destroyed the infrastructure of 2 entire provinces. Chiang's forces were too weak to prevent the Japanese rampage, yet abandoning the American airmen was unthinkable given the alliance between China and the United States. Chinese military units suffered heavy casualties attempting to evacuate the surviving raiders, while protecting civilian populations from Japanese reprisals. Father John Birch and other American missionaries found themselves trapped between their humanitarian obligations and the reality of Japanese brutality. Birch personally led several raider crews to safety through Japanese lines, using his knowledge of local dialects and customs to evade capture. His network of Chinese Christian contacts provided safe houses, medical care, and guides for the dangerous journey to free Chinese territory. Technical Sergeant David John Thatcher's heroic care of the injured crew of Ruptured Duck became legendary among Chinese civilians who witnessed American airmen risking their lives. For wounded comrades, Thatcher's dedication to keeping Lieutenant Ted William Lawson alive during their harrowing escape through Japanese-occupied territory demonstrated the unbreakable bonds forged by combat and shared sacrifice. The Japanese military's systematic destruction of Chinese infrastructure backfired strategically by strengthening Chinese resistance and hardening American resolve. Reports of atrocities committed against civilians who had helped the raiders reach Washington through missionary networks and diplomatic channels, providing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with powerful propaganda material to justify increased support for China. By the end of May 1942, the full scope of Japanese retaliation was becoming clear. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians had died in Operation Seigo, victims of a revenge campaign that exceeded even Japanese standards of brutality. The Doolittle raid had achieved its strategic objective of demonstrating American reach and resolve, but the human cost paid by Chinese allies would haunt the surviving raiders for the rest of their lives. On October 15, 1942, exactly 6 months after their daring raid on Japan, 3 Doolittle raiders stood before a Japanese military tribunal in Shanghai, facing charges that would determine their fate. Lieutenant Robert John Meader, Staff Sergeant William Joseph Dieter, and Corporal Jacob David Deschesser represented the 8 captured airmen who had endured months of torture, starvation, and interrogation in Japanese military prisons. Their courage in the face of inevitable death would become part of the Doolittle raid's enduring legacy. The Japanese prosecutors, led by Colonel Sotojiro Tatsuda, argued that the American airmen were war criminals who had deliberately targeted civilian areas. During their bombing attack, this fabricated charge ignored the fact that all targets had been military and industrial facilities, but it provided legal justification for the death sentences that Emperor Hirohito's government was determined to impose. The trial was a mockery of justice, conducted without proper legal representation or adherence to international law. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, safely back in the United States, learned of his men's fate through intelligence channels and diplomatic protests. The aging aviator, who had been promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, carried the weight of knowing that his volunteers were paying the ultimate price for their shared moment of glory over Tokyo. He would spend the rest of his life honoring the memory of those who didn't return. On October 14, 1942, Lieutenant Dean Everett Hallmark, Lieutenant William Gardner Farrow, and Staff Sergeant Harold Arthur Spatz were executed by firing squad at Kyangwon Military Prison near Shanghai. Their deaths violated every provision of the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners of war, but international law meant nothing to a Japanese military machine drunk on conquest and revenge. The 3 airmen died with dignity, refusing to provide their captors with the propaganda victory they sought. The surviving 5 captured raiders, Lieutenant Robert John Meader, Lieutenant Charles Joseph Ozick Jr., Staff Sergeant William Joseph Dieter, Corporal Jacob David Deschizer, and Staff Sergeant Donald Eldred Fitzmaurice had their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment through diplomatic pressure from neutral nations. They would spend the remainder of the war in solitary confinement, sustained only by their memories of that April morning when they had flown off the USS Hornet into history. Meanwhile, the strategic consequences of the Doolittle raid continued to reverberate throughout the Pacific War. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, recognized that the raid had goaded the Japanese into premature offensive action at Midway Island. The resulting battle on June 4 through 7, 1942, would cost Japan for aircraft carriers and many of their most experienced pilots, marking the beginning of American victory in the Pacific. Technical Sergeant David John Thatcher's heroic care of his wounded crewmates became the subject of medical studies that improved combat survival techniques. For the remainder of the war, his improvised medical procedures, learned through trial and error while evading Japanese patrols, saved Lieutenant Ted William Lawson's life and demonstrated the importance of combat first aid training for all aircrew members. The Chinese civilian population that had suffered so terribly during Japanese retaliation was not forgotten by the surviving raiders. After the war, many of the airmen returned to China to establish schools, hospitals, and orphanages in the areas that had been devastated by Operation Sago. Their efforts to rebuild what had been destroyed in their name became a testament to the bonds forged between American and Chinese allies. During the darkest hours of World War II, General Doolittle's final assessment of the raid emphasized its psychological rather than physical impact. The 16 B-25 bombers had dropped only 6 to 4 bombs on Japanese targets, causing minimal damage to war production facilities. However, they had demonstrated that Japan was vulnerable to American air power, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, and provided America with its first victory over the Empire of the Rising Sun. On November 14, 1947, 5 years after the raid, the surviving members of Doolittle's Raiders held their first reunion in Miami, Florida. 62 of the original 80 volunteers attended, sharing memories of their shared adventure and honoring the colleagues who had not returned. They established an annual tradition that would continue for 7 decades, a brotherhood forged in combat and sustained by mutual respect and shared sacrifice. The Doolittle Raid remains one of the most audacious military operations in American history, a testament to the courage of 80 volunteers who accepted a near-suicidal mission. When their country needed heroes, their legacy lives on in the annals of military aviation, a reminder that determination, training, and sacrifice can achieve the impossible when ordinary men are called upon to perform extraordinary deeds.